Well, there's many unknowns, but I think the biggest one that we have currently is, do we even have the capacity on the ground to confront the challenges that we have? And, my view is that we don't have that capacity, but how to build it is also unknown because we've forgotten how to build it. We currently have, outsourced the brain of the public sector in many cases to the private sector. The private sector itself has become ultra financialized, in many cases, extracting more value out of the system than creating it. So it's not so much about unknowns, it's actually about rethinking from scratch how do you actually build a dynamic public private partnership to be able to confront the crises that we are facing, from the climate crisis, the health crisis, the economic crisis, but to do it from first principles instead of just patching up the system. So in the case of the state, there's been too much focus on the role of the public policy as fixing market failures. So you literally are set up to fail because you're always too little too late. You're just bandaging things up. Instead, what we need is a perspective about co-creating and co-shaping our economy to deliver on certain goals, principally inclusive and sustainable growth. But what I've argued in my recent book called Mission Economy is those goals need to be moonshots. They need to be missions that we can actually answer. Did we achieve it or not? And the way to do that is also about looking at within governance of particular institutions in both business and in government, which I think have been misgoverned. So in that sense, I really believe let's start from the outcomes orientation of what we need to deliver and backtrack to make sure we actually have purpose oriented institutions in both business and government. So the mission economy perspective tries to go beyond this idea of the state is good, is it bad, is it too big, is it too small? It really is about governing the relationships between the state and all sorts of other different actors. And one of the first problems is the state itself, as I've already mentioned, has been framed problematically. It's not even seen as a value creator. It's seen just as a market fixer or an enabler, a de-risker of the value being created in the private sector, which has not actually then allowed it to build the capabilities within public institutions for it to be agile, creative, flexible, and so on. But the other thing is, the kind of problems we face, they are at all sorts of different levels. Some are at the neighborhood level, some are at the city level, regional, national, international. There's different types of public policies, obviously, that we require to confront those. But I always go back to the idea of outcomes orientation, mission orientation. And for that, it doesn't matter what size of the state we're talking about, we're looking at different tools that are required. You're no longer picking winners, you're picking the willing. You're not there just to hand out money to different types of firms, sectors, or technologies. You're there to help transform those firms, sectors and technologies to move towards the solutions we need. For this, I think for COVID-19, what was so interesting was there was in some countries, conditions attached to the recovery funds that were given to business. Like in France, President Macron said, we're not here just to bail you out, we're here to help transform. And so the recovery fund given to the airlines and given to automobiles was conditional on those sectors committing to reducing their carbon emissions. So that sort of conditionality is about a social compact. When you don't have that, then the role of the state is useless. It just ends up, giving subsidies, guarantees to different actors to stay in place. And I think this focus on transformation and missions as outcomes orientation is equally important for small problems and for big problems. So the point of thinking in a mission oriented way is not to begin with the idea of how much money do we have? What should we do with it? It's to begin with the question, what do we need to do? And to backtrack and find a way to actually finance it. And by having mission oriented and outcomes oriented budgeting, which, by the way, Brazil actually is one of the countries which has been most innovative around, this changes how we think about the debt and the deficit. Many countries have high debt to GDP not because they are spending too much in the public funds, but they are spending very badly. They are not investing strategically. They don't have innovation systems. They don't have increases in their productivity because the private and the public sector are not doing their job. So really, by worrying about what the problems are, and B, structuring the institutions on the ground to be as capable as possible, but also the policies to be as strategic and long-term focused as possible, then what you end up seeing is, of course, that GDP, which is the denominator of debt to GDP, should actually grow much more than if you're just worried about your budget constraint and then acting in a very siloed, limited, static way. Again, in many countries which have low deficits, you can still have a high debt to GDP precisely because of the lack of that capability and dynamism on the ground. Having said that, one of the key roles of mission-oriented financing should be to crowd in as many other types of finance as possible in the business community, but also in other types of organizations. And that crowding in effect, the multiplicative effect, is much higher when you have mission-oriented, strategic, long-run, committed finance from the public sector, as opposed to just handouts, again, to different types of areas based on static notions of what needs financing. For example, a sector-specific approach instead of a problem-specific approach might end up just giving different sectors money, but with no focus on what the transformation is actually required, so it doesn't have that transformative and catalytic effect inside the private sector. We should remember that decades of austerity in so many different countries have really weakened our social fabric. They have made, for example, the COVID-19 crisis much worse than it actually had to be. And austerity, of course, is this aggregate word. It makes people think of just public cuts, to budgets, but actually it falls on very, very concrete structures. In the UK, for example, after the financial crisis, instead of penalizing the private sector and the banking sector, which caused the crisis, we penalized people. So mental health budgets were cut. After school clubs were cut. All sorts of health services were cut in the name of reducing our deficits. And all of this had distributional consequences in terms of who was actually impacted. So it's very dangerous just to use words like austerity without always making it very clear who is being damaged by it, because it's not austerity across the board. We continue to have in so many different countries corporate welfare, which is money given by governments to particular types of corporations. So that's not austerity. The other thing is, a mission-oriented approach, as I've been arguing, really has to have a new social compact at the center. I've talked about conditionalities in order to foster dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic public-private partnerships. And part of those conditions should also be that workers should be invested in as a part of the quid pro quo of different types of businesses getting support through subsidies, guarantees, recovery funds, bailouts, and so forth. And unfortunately, we often don't have that. And we don't even have conditions to make sure that profits are reinvested back into production. In fact, the idea that we have a world without work is completely false. That idea comes from the idea that, robots and AI, artificial intelligence, take over, jobs. But actually, that's always been the case for the last 200 years, that mechanization has been labor displacing. But as long as the profits being earned from mechanization were reinvested back into the economy, and another part, then new jobs, new skills appeared. What you have from the 1980s with the obsession of maximizing shareholder value and share prices through activities like share buybacks and very high dividend payouts and so on, is a lack of reinvestment of profits back into the economy. That hurts workers. That hurts long-run production. That hurts innovation. So we should stop blaming the robots for the lack of jobs and really look inside corporate governance structures and bring this notion of purpose and stakeholder value to the center of corporate governance to make sure that workers are benefiting, but also to the center of public-private relationships through conditionalities that make sure that government funds are not just given out for free, but also as a condition. The condition should be to make sure that we do have more sustainable economies, more inclusive economies, and that workers, for example, when we have a green transition, are being invested in order to transition with the economy instead of outside of the economy. So, my desirable tomorrow is actually to really focus on the education and the curriculum that we need inside the civil service in order for the word bureaucracy to no longer be a negative word. There is no reason that the word bureaucratic should be a bad word. We just have the wrong kinds of bureaucracies. So, the reason that I've set up an institute called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL in London is precisely to link the path-breaking research that we need around concepts like public value, public purpose, mission-oriented policies to the actual practice on the ground. So working with policymakers, but also the new curriculum that we need within the civil service to go away from the public choice theory and new public management training that civil servants have had globally, which has made them fear government failure even more than market failure. So my desirable tomorrow is a new education, a new curriculum, a new training, new textbooks for global bureaucrats to be truly more dynamic, more creative, and to see themselves as investors of first resort, not just lenders of last resort, market co-shapers and co-creators, not just market fixers. But that also feeds back to those same civil service to make sure they deliver on that. So concepts like public value need to be nested within our public organizations to make sure that the public service is structured properly. The question would be, what is the real bottleneck? You know, we all have great ideas. I'm sure everyone on this panel and for the wonderful Desirable Tomorrow conference is saying wonderful things. Where is the real change that's required in order for these great ideas to be implemented? What is the problem? Is it ideology? Is it lack of capacity? Is it, too much bureaucracy? Is it that maybe we don't communicate well enough? What is it? Because we have to stop thinking that it's just about the lack of ideas, and we need to really treat this as a battle. And in any battle, you would make sure that the ground is fertile for the battle to take place. And unfortunately, I think we have focused too much on just talking and not enough on walking, and not enough metrics that are actually signaling whether we ourselves, as people with ideas, need to change, whether it's how we're communicating, who are we communicating with, or also listening enough. We shouldn't forget that Marx, before he died, he said, "I'm not a Marxist," because he saw how ideological many people were that were calling themselves Marxists, and they were only reading Marx. We need to be reading everyone and making sure that we are modernizing our own ideas, but especially, fighting the fight, which means having the right tools on the ground and not thinking that it's enough to profess. We need to be listening and be humble. And in our institute, we call it practice-based theorizing, learning from the ground and bringing it back to the theory itself. When you don't have that feedback, you become part of the problem.